Hi everyone, this is Profe Montes, and we're going to be talking about the Central American communities, history, and enclaves. Student learning outcomes. List at least 3 countries in Central America. Identify top 3 reasons for migration. Identify the reasons for civil unrest within El Salvador. Discuss the U.S. government involvement in Central America. Identify the School of the Americas. Define what an enclave is. Give an example of an enclave in Los Angeles area. Identify 2 key revolutionary figures in Central America. So this is the video that you are asked to watch. It should be fine. I know it's saying video unavailable right now, but you can press the link, and it's about an hour or so documentary about the history of Central America and the different countries. I do want you to be aware that I oftentimes put what's called a trigger warning, as I mentioned in the introductory module, where it is a very graphic video and documentary about the true atrocities that happen with war and violence within Central America. So it's important to be ready or understand that you might see these things. Take breaks and pause if you don't want or can't see them, and it's important to know that it may bring up some issues overall for many of us. All right, so one of the things is to identify some of the countries within Central America, and so here is a map that you can take a look at. What we're going to talk about and what the Harvest of Empire documentary talks about is mainly Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And so you can learn a little bit more about that and just know the locations of them throughout the Americas. So here's a little bit more in terms of map and location of El Salvador. And what we're going to do in this survey class again is we're doing a short introduction. By no means is this a extensive information or history of the countries nor of Central America, but it's important to do an introduction for you all to understand a little bit about U.S. involvement, why there's migration, different reasons, and so we'll do a little bit of introduction, and really documentary is where you're going to get the most information for this module, so it's important that you watch it. So some of the major causes for diversity of immigrant ethnicities, and also the reasons for movement and for leaving and migration we've already talked about before. But first, lack of jobs. So economic reasons in terms of finding the American dream or being able to find economic stability or even just find jobs, right? So second is war and violence. This has happened both in many countries across the world where people migrate to the U.S. in search of refugee status, specifically fleeing war and violence in their communities. Also, the 1965 immigration law removed the prohibition from people of color to immigrate at that time. But again, since then, as you know, the immigration reform and changes in policy have kind of gone back and forth according to the political party oftentimes, or person that's in office, or people who are in office. And so that changes according to people and people who are elected within the elected officials and holding office. So it is very key to understand that the third reason for migration has been forced migration in the case of Africans but being forced to come to America. Important and interesting immigration story around a Salvadorian grandmother. This is Curly Vasquez of Pero Like. It's a division, or the Latinx division of BuzzFeed. And they do videos, like fun, interesting videos about culture, identity, foods, and also politics. And so Curly Vasquez did this one about his grandmother's immigration story from El Salvador to the U.S. So take a look at it to find out a little bit more about his own, even though he doesn't call it Nepantla, his own feelings of Nepantla, and also his trying to reconnect and connections to his Central American and specifically Salvadorian history. A little bit in terms of background, there was growing tensions in the 1970s El Salvador, there was a wealth distribution with 5% control, 38% of the national income. Here in the U.S., a lot of people talk about the 99 to the 1%, and the 1% being those all of the rich people, or usually corporations, and high people who have the most money, and the 99% are all the workers. This is what they're talking about in terms of wealth distribution. This one's showing a little bit of different numbers and percentages, but this was what was happening. Also in land, a few large farms controlled a third of the land that could be used. And so it was a place where people were trying, similar to other countries, to gain access to their land, to their rightful land oftentimes, or to be able to grow food and sustain themselves. There was election fraud. There was repression in big ways that you'll see in the documentary in terms of disappearances, assassinations, and also death squads. And so as a result of that, and also through that, people were trying to distribute the wealth instead of having it in the hands of the few. Distribute the land instead of having it in the hands of a few, and stop election fraud, stop the disappearances, stop all of these things. And so there was a radicalization and advocacy similar to what's happening in 2020 in the U.S., where people are rising up to say, no more, we want to change things. And so there were social movements that began. Also, one of the biggest things that happened in the repression during in El Salvador was Archbishop Oscar Romero's assassination in 1980, as he was a large advocate for the communities and those who were being oppressed. And when he was assassinated, many people mourned, of course, but also it was just a showing of the level of what would happen in those communities. So we're going to learn just a little bit about each country, but again, the Harvest of Empire documentary is really where we get the most information. Many of those who come from or are part, or your families from El Salvador, will have an important and key connection in some way, shape, or form to the Civil War. Some people have different opinions and different sides of it, but either way, it's an important and key thing that has happened within the Salvadorian history. There was two main political parties, the Arena, which was on the right in the military origins, and then the left, which was the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, so more guerrilla and left origins. So the left on the right. Overall, it was really key, the FMLN, as it's known, or acronym in English, was really trying to oftentimes work for those that were the oppressed, for those who didn't have the land, who didn't have the wealth, etc., and who were being repressed. You'll see a lot more of this again within the documentary. So the Civil War had a very extensive toll on the Salvadoran community. Over 75,000 died, 6,000 disappearances, 400,000 internally displaced, and 500,000 at least fleeing to the U.S. at that time. The human rights violations were plentiful, in that 95% of violations attributed to the government or linked paramilitary forces. So these human rights violations were happening by the Salvadorian government or by the community, or not by the community, but by the Salvadorian government. And so it was really, really dangerous for many to come, or for many to be there, and that's why there's a big fleeing or coming to the U.S. In many times, in many generations, but specifically after and during this time. So it's important to learn about some of these stories. Oftentimes, of course, mothers and women were the biggest advocates, usually for as human rights leaders themselves, but also for their family and their disappeared family. What has happened since then is ending the conflict. There was a changing political environment. It was important to know that there's the School of the Americas, as you'll see in the documentary, is a location in the United States, in Georgia, where many Central American military leaders, as well as leaders from other parts of countries across the Americas, were trained to assassinate, to kill, to torture communities. And so learning from the U.S. government what to do, and oftentimes then being paid or being used and asked to be doing things for the U.S. government or on behalf of the U.S. government's interests. That was what would happen in many of these countries, and they were always taught or actually went to school on how to do this at the School of the Americas. The UN had some involvement and endorses peace efforts in 1989. There's truth commissions that talk about what happened and really bring out the information of the stories of the very traumatic and tragic stories. And there's a eventual, and many say that, you know, you could talk about still a lot of the issues that are happening now in many of these countries, but this is an important time in the story of Central American communities, and specifically El Salvador, to talk about the migration that happened. Where did they migrate to? Specifically Los Angeles. There's a term that we're going to use in this class and that is used called enclaves. And it's an area or area group where people live, work, and survive. So if you think about the Central American community, people oftentimes think of the enclave of Central Americans as being MacArthur Park and Mid-City. And those areas. And so Pico Union, where you have a lot of specific stores catering to that community, specific associations, sports groups, music, foods, etc. So the enclave, an example would be Pico Union or MacArthur Park for Central American communities. Overall, it's really important to realize the U.S. role in the region and the U.S. School of the Americas role in the region, and what had happened there, and the immense violence and issues that have happened as a result of that. It's also key to know some of what's happening now in terms of that. When it says the future, it's pretty much now. There's still migration, there's still economic issues. In Mexico, we have what's called the North American Free Trade Agreement, which passed in January 1st, 1994, or went to an effect on that date. And it allows for commerce and corporations to go back and forth and have little to no laws against them, but people cannot cross back and forth, right? And CAFTA is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which it does basically the same thing, but with Central American companies. The rise in gangs and violence was huge in the communities of that area of Salvador and Central America, as well as here in the U.S. with gangs like Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street and others rising to find almost somewhat of their own enclave, to find a way to come together, but also and find community of sorts, but also because of a lot of them having dealt with or being migrants from very, very, very traumatic experiences, and then having PTSD, both the post-traumatic but also post-Indianization, as we could call, stress disorder. So take a look at this video that introduces a little bit more of information about Salvadorian women and will explain why they moved. One of the student learning outcomes is to know some key people within Central American and specifically Salvadorian history, and this is Archbishop Oscar Romero. He was a Catholic religious leader known as the voice for the voiceless. He advocated for the rights of the poor and the oppressed in El Salvador, and was, as a result, assassinated during Mass by the U.S.-backed Salvadorian military. He preached liberation theology. If people are not have never heard of that, it's actually more of like a social justice mass or church that really is about the Catholic movement calling for equality and justice for all. He begged the National Guard to stop killing civilians, and then therefore was targeted by the government for his advocacy for the poor. Another person to know is Farabundo Martí, who is the FMLN is named after, or has the name, right? And he was a rebel leader. He founded the Communist Party of Central America, and he hoped to organize a peasant or farm worker uprising in 1932. There's a documentary that talks about Maria's story, Maria Serrano, and it's, I think, you can take a look at this, or at least a clip and trailer, but a lot of what I want to share with you is the bringing of a human face to war, a human face to civil war, to violence, and specifically a woman or femme's face, a feminine and femme version of what's happening with the communities and the families. Now, within Guatemala, we also will learn more about it through the Harvest of Empire. But one of the key figures you may want to know about is Otto René Castillo, a poet and revolutionary. And he was captured, tortured, and murdered by the Guatemalan government. Rigoberta Menchú, Guatemala, most of you may know her or have heard of her. She is one of the most famous of many of the people that we'll be talking about in this module. She's a Quiche Mayan grassroots organizer for indigenous rights, women's rights, and labor rights. Her family was murdered by the Guatemalan army. She won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work advocating for indigenous rights. This is an image of her. And many of people know her through the book that she wrote, I, Rigoberta Menchú, a global bestseller, and it really talked about her daily life and also the daily injustices of indigenous peoples within Guatemala. Now, when we talk about this, oftentimes when we talk about these countries, we're not always talking. So this is the book that Rigoberta wrote. It's a global bestseller, or was, and it exposed the daily injustices of peasants and indigenous people in Guatemala and really called for universal human rights. Many people have read this around the world and found out more about the plight of indigenous communities overall, but also those specifically within Guatemala. Nicaragua, we learn more about within the documentary again, but it's important to know about Augusto César Sandino, a revolutionary leader, and led a rebellion against the U.S. military occupation. And many people know, similar to the FMLN or others, people have talked about the Sandinistas or others who are speaking about or usually talk about the different issues and advocacy that happen within their country. So I know we're not going into a lot about it today or in this module, but the documentary goes into depth about the struggles, about what has happened there, what are the key reasons, usually because of taking the land for resources, which happens across the world, but also specifically in indigenous communities. Learning outcomes, I want us to remember all of these different things. We're just going into a little bit of the information and survey about these communities. We're not going into depth, but the documentary Harvest of Empire is really going to give you a background in terms of the issues, the oppression, the indigenous communities, the violence, and much more about what was happening and how the government worked with the UN. Some of the government worked with the U.S. Government to oppress many of the indigenous communities and peoples of Central America. So it's important to know each story. They're very similar, but very specific and detailed in each of the different countries. So take a look at it and make sure that you have these student learning outcomes ready and with the information for your keyword log and for the quiz. Thank you so much.